Great question. First, I think that the fact that the United States asked Pakistan to mediate suggests that it's an important role. I mean, there were other channels, right? Witkoff was speaking with Araghchi. They're on texting basis. And so that wasn't working. And with the collapse of the Omani channel, which led to this war, and then at the end of the day, Pakistan is indispensable in this context because if you just look at Iran and its relationship in its strategic environment, it's pretty, from a geostrategic point of view, it's pretty lonely. It has no allies in the neighborhood. And Pakistan also has a troubled relationship with Iran, but it has the least troubled relationship with Iran. So there was no other actor that could step in. It's a neighbor of Pakistan. I think the relationship between the prime minister and between the field marshal and the White House is a close one, particularly with President Donald Trump himself. So I think, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of confidence that I see that the Americans repose in Islamabad, uh, but also the fact that the Iranians have no other choice as well. So I think that Pakistan was not selected in a very sort of, if you will, casual manner. I think this was done deliberately because of the broader landscape in which this war is taking place. I think first it's not stuck. I think Pakistan is clearly a US, Saudi, and Turkish ally and Chinese ally. And the Iranians know that. And because of those reasons, Iran has no choice but to negotiate through the Pakistanis. And the neighborly relationship that goes back, decades to the inception of Pakistan and perhaps even before, given the cultural and historical ties, religious ties, uh, Iran has no choice. So I don't think Pakistan is stuck. I think Pakistan has an advantage, the strategic advantage that it's using, and the Americans recognize that. And I think that the fact that Pakistan is an ally of the Americans and the Saudis is all the more reason why the Iranians would want to negotiate because ultimately they can't talk to them directly. They need somebody there to mediate this conversation. And initially, I thought that this process was more of a channel, if you will, to relay messages back and forth. But as is the case with any third party involvement, as time goes by and the stakes are very high, that channel matures and the third party gains more, space, if not agency, if you will. Definitely, we're doing more than, Pakistan is doing more than just passaging American messages back to the Iranians. They're actually convincing the Iranians that this is in their interest and it's in the collective interest of the region to come to the table. Likewise, I think that the relationship between the Trump administration and the current government of Pakistan, the PMLN government, along with the GHQ, has come to a point where Pakistan has the space to even, shape the thinking of Washington. I think that that's also happening. But it's not the same. It's qualitatively very different because obviously the US is a superpower. The dynamics between the superpower and Pakistan, which depends on the superpower, are very different than the dynamics between Iran and Pakistan. I mean, Iran takes Pakistan seriously because it's a nuclear neighbor and it's a big country. It's not a small power. And I think this is why the Americans chose Pakistan because the Omanis had a sort of a more of a junior relationship to the Iranians. The Iranians did not see the Omanis the way they see the Pakistanis. So yes, there's that variance, but it doesn't mean that the Americans are not listening to what advice they're getting from the field marshal and from the prime minister and the deputy prime minister. Yeah, I know that's how the sort of the open source description of of what is happening. That's how it's being described. Look, there's another way of sort of looking at all of this. Uh, why is anybody assuming that American and Israeli interests are just sort of one and the same thing? These are two different countries. Yes, they're allies. Yes, they are very close allies. And of course, they are fighting the war together. They're organically tethered to one another. But that doesn't mean that American interests are exactly the same as Israeli interests. And it's only natural. This isn't sort of it shouldn't be seen as sort of like problematic. It's just a natural reality of life. I mean, look, Pakistan is helping America. Uh, does that mean Pakistani and American interests are all the same? No, they're not. Okay. And so the Israeli interest is this regime has been a major threat to the state of Israel because it has backed all these groups that are fighting Israel. And therefore, it takes a different view of what should be the outcome of this war. It wants to see the regime uh, not be left in a situation where it's able to threaten Iran again. I'm sorry, able to threaten Israel again. The American issue is very different. America is a superpower. Iran is one country out of so many others that the United States has to deal with. The Middle East is one region out of many. And so the US view is always going to be different. So, yes, uh, it's very natural for the Israelis to look at these negotiations and say, well, you know what, they don't really serve our interests because if there is an understanding that leads to this regime not really changing its behavior and actually coming out from underneath international sanctions, then they could rearm and we could be backfighting them again in the future. So that's the view of the Israelis. So yes, they're not comfortable with this. But having said that, what you want and what you can have, and this goes for any geopolitical actor without any exceptions, is that those two things are not the same. And as I was walking into this interview, I saw the news about Prime Minister Netanyahu saying, okay, we're going to put a pause to the attacks in Lebanon and we're going to negotiate. Does that mean it's over? No, but that is evidence that the United States influence is working. That the United States, see, the thing is that when you're working with an ally with whom you have a divergence of interests, you don't you handle with care. It's like a fragile situation. You don't want to come out publicly and take a stance against your ally. What you do is you talk behind the scenes. And I think that's what has happened. I think the president has spoken to the prime minister of Israel and told him, look, this is where we're going. You don't have to worry about, your interest. We're not going to end this situation in a way that leaves Iran the ability to continue threatening you. And if you look at one of our demands, it's that the Iranians stop supporting armed proxy groups. So I think that that's what's happened here. So that's a good question. So look, obviously, the Iranians have input into this, but it's not the same input that the Israelis have. Okay. The Israeli input is far more quantitatively, however you want to measure it, is far greater. Okay. The we also have to pick apart what is the Iranian interest here with Lebanon, because you look at their imperatives. Their imperative is very clear that they came to the table, the 11th hour deal that was struck by the Pakistanis with the Iranians was after the President of the United States openly threatened to hit infrastructure, specifically naming power plants and bridges. And there was some reports about rail lines also being targeted, or at least the plan to target. That's the last thing that the Iranians want to see happen because they can lose the ability to, wage offensive war. But what they cannot tolerate is chaos at home that leads to a collapse of the state. Because think about it, if your infrastructure is hit, that creates social commotion that turns political. And the regime, as weak as it has become, cannot afford that. Therefore, it came to the table. So now what do they really mean that we're going to go ahead and, not agree to the ceasefire if you don't include Lebanon in it? I think it's much more complicated. I think they're using the Lebanese thing. Obviously, they have to satisfy their proxy. They can't just throw their proxy under the bus. They have to do something for it. And of course, they have sort of a credibility as well in the broader proxy network that, hey, if you could sort of throw your premier proxy, Hezbollah, under the bus, then what is our stance, or where do we stand in regards to your interests? So Iran can't just let that happen. But what Iran also knows that it can't afford the opposite. That what if the other side says, okay, sure, you want to walk away from this deal. And then, you're going to bear the consequences. That's not an outcome, as I already explained, that's acceptable to the Iranians. I think what the Iranians are doing is that they're looking at this demand, this pressure to stop supporting proxies, armed proxies, and looking at what the United States is trying to do in terms of disarming Hezbollah. And I think because from the president's point of view, if you look at how he's dealt with how, Steve Witkoff has dealt with Hamas, okay, how they've dealt with the Taliban, how they've dealt with Ahmad al-Shara, who was the former head of Al-Qaeda. This administration is very pragmatic in that sense. This administration is saying, look, we understand you have relationships going back decades with these actors. We're not saying sever them completely to zero. We're saying just tell them to behave and don't support them. Don't give them weapons. Don't arm them. Don't encourage them to disrupt the region because we want to retrench from the Eurasian landmass. We're trying to set up a new architecture here, which has multiple pillars. It has Turkey, it has Saudi, it has Pakistan, there's Israel. We're already having a hard time getting these guys all on the same page because of Gaza. We can't have Hezbollah and the Houthis doing this on your behalf. And so use your influence to help us disarm. And I think that's what the Iranians want. Because if you think about it, uh, Hezbollah has been militarily weakened. If it continues to fight Israel, then it's looking at even further losses. You've lost your capabilities as a paramilitary organization or as a military organization. What you don't want to lose is your standing as a political movement and a social phenomenon in Lebanon. So I think that that's where the Iranians are headed, that hey, you want this and we want this, so can we come to a table? But the way it's framed in the threatening language is just sort of par for the course. That's just your classic bargaining. Great question. So I think that they're not very far apart, but that doesn't mean that they're very close either. Okay. What do I mean by that? Let me unpack it. There is no way the Vice President of the United States would be meeting with the Speaker of the Parliament from Iran in Pakistan if there wasn't a baseline understanding that yes, we're willing to give up enrichment. Let's talk about the missiles, okay? And let's talk about the proxies. And we're willing to work with you on the Strait of Hormuz disruption. That has to have happened. So, in principle, it's not about whether we will deal or not. It's yes, we're ready to deal. We now need to engineer the deal. Engineering of the deal from an Iranian point of view, because it's clearly the weaker side and it does not want to look, and it's existential for the regime. It can't just look like it capitulated and then remain in power. Okay. Especially with a majority of the country hostile to the regime. In fact, if they capitulate, if they come across as capitulating, they lose their own base as well. And so that would be that is just an unacceptable and intolerable situation for the Iranians. So, as is the case with all diplomatic efforts, you engineer the deal. you can come up with ways in which you can sort of craft it so that you don't look like you've capitulated. It's like a win-win for both sides. But getting to that win-win, and that's the challenge now of the Pakistanis, is to make sure these two sides are moving along, and there isn't sort of, a if you will, backward movement or backsliding from where they've come so far. So I think that is where we are. The details have to be worked out. So let's, if I hate to put numbers, I think we're sort of more than, halfway there, if I had to say it. But that remaining 40 to 50%, that's still the distance that needs to be covered, is very crucial. And, things can go wrong. There are just so many variables here that things can go wrong. So let's take it one day at a time. I think it's a bit of both. I think, look, both sides have to come out. The Iranians have to survive and say, look, we fought the good fight and we endured. The Americans have to come out and say, look, this was a threat. But look, what does the president want to achieve? Let's just be, clear over here from in obviously there's the national security, geopolitical, foreign policy angle to this, but there's also a domestic political angle for the president. The president is in his last term. The president has sort of placed himself, situated himself as someone who brings conflicts to an end, and he's trying to position himself that way. His goal is to try and accomplish what no other American president, going all the way back to Jimmy Carter, has been able to do. So I think that that's why this is so important for the United States is putting a lot of stock into this, and there's a lot of energy and time and other forms of investment. I mean, look, I mean, this war, is expensive to say the least. I mean, that's sort of like, that's not even accurate in terms of how to describe it. It's very expensive. So why is he doing that? He's doing that because there are certain goals that need to be met. So both sides have to come out and say, yes, it was all worth it, because they have to justify it. And I think that, again, for the Iranians, it's far more acute because for them, it's a matter of survival. For the US, it's not a matter of survival. The US, in the past has lost wars, but it's not an existential issue for the United States. This is more of a political economic problem for the US. Absolutely. Look, so what is the Iranian imperative? And it's always been this way. I mean, one of the things that this regime has not been able to get away from is that it's always constantly pursuing its primary imperative, which is regime survival. It's that has been the driving force, and it's never been able to sort of fully achieve that reality and say, okay, now we're stable, we can go to a second, third order imperative. Now more than ever before, that imperative is the only thing on their minds, the only thing that matters to them. This is the top priority. This is the only priority. How do you achieve it? Well, one, you end the war because the war is eroding the regime's ability to maintain power at home. But they can't just simply go back to February 27th when there was no war. They were already weak. The entire nuclear program was sort of, they've used it. Yes, they do want to acquire nuclear weapons, but they know that they can't just walk across that line and say, hey, we're a nuclear weapon state. They're gonna because no power has ever become a nuclear weapon state by publicly declaring that there's a nuclear program. Iran is the only one, is the exception to that rule. So the Iranians eventually want to get to nuclear weapons, but well before that, they need to get out of sanctions. And this has been a tool going back decades. I would say going back to the Bush administration days, that the Iranians have sort of been using this as a leverage to try and extract concessions from the United States on the sanctions regime that's been in place and has been intensifying over the years and decades. So, yes, these sanctions have to come off at least enough to where this regime can get back onto the path of recovery, because there is no going back to January 27th. Sorry, February 27th. They have to move forward, and regime survival cannot just be ensured by an end of war. And then they have to sort of say that why, what did they get out of the war? You know, there's a cost, but what is the benefit? So yes, and I think the US understands that, but the US is not going to provide them with sort of like sanctions relief in general. It will, I think every little element of that will be debated, negotiated. That if you want this off, then you do this. And so I think those are the conversations that we're headed into, assuming nothing goes wrong. So that's another reality that we're not going to go back to ever again. Until this war began, the idea of Iran attacking across the Persian Gulf using missiles and drones to strike at the energy-rich Gulf Arab states was a theoretical construct. That came to pass. The unthinkable became reality after the war began. This is the new normal, strategic normal, okay, that the United States is trying to sort of somehow manage, that it remains it remains a threat, but it doesn't become normalized. And that's why the cap on the ballistic missile capability as one of the key conditions of peace. So I think that I don't think there's any difference in the Saudi or the UAE or the Qatari or others on this issue. Even the Omanis who are allies of the Iranians and have not been struck that hard, they don't want to see this happen either. So I think that this is the challenge of how do you sort of put that genie back into the bottle? uh, because this has happened now. Now, we need to have a new regime. This is what the Iranians are trying to leverage in terms of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. I call it disruption because closure means something very specific. It's technical. It means you have a navy, you've actually shut down, physically shut it down. What this is a disruption thing. It's bad enough. But the point is that uh, the Iranians are leveraging that. So it's going to be very interesting to see. This is probably going to be the most significant, if you will, issue of negotiation, because it's very easy to say, okay, what does zero enrichment mean? We people have an idea of what that looks like. Okay, oh, you can't do it on your soil. Whatever nuclear enriched uranium you already have, those stockpiles need to be transferred out. You can have access to enrich uranium through a consortium that's not in your country. We know all of that. But what does it mean to have ballistic missile capability, keep it capped, and not threaten the other side of the Gulf? And so that whole architecture, that whole management system is going to be very crucial. And I think that's going to be one of the most difficult parts of this negotiation. It's another very good question. So let me sort of first paint this sort of three-way picture. I think it's fair to say that there isn't a tug of war between Washington and Beijing when it comes to Islamabad. There's no tug of war. What does that mean? I think the Americans are comfortable that, look, China's a neighbor. There are things that China can do for Pakistan, and therefore it's going to have that relationship. I think Chinese are also comfortable that, yes, there are certain things, the Pakistanis rely on us for, but there are many things we can't give them that only the United States can give them. Therefore, they're naturally going to have that relationship as well. So it can't be a tug of war over this. So I think that's sort of the super architecture of this three-way relationship. Now, if you drop altitude and come into the current moment and you say, okay, so what's happening right now? I, we have to understand that there is a much bigger global issue that people are not paying attention to, unless you're focused on China, is the US-China economic accommodation, the efforts by the US to reach an accommodation, particularly this administration, where it's abandoning the whole sort of counter China, the old narrative of counter China. There's a new way of, dealing with China which is through geoeconomic tools as opposed to sort of military tools that this administration is trying to pursue. So that is a conversation that has to happen and has been happening. We have the meeting between President Trump and President Xi coming up in mid-May in Beijing. It's going to be a huge event, and it'll be very telling of where these two powers are going when it comes to the world. So the Chinese have that on their mind. Okay. And they're looking at Iran and what's happening with Iran and what's happening between US and Pakistan through that lens. How does that affect that imperative? That's the most important imperative. Iran is not a, Iran is important in the sense that the Chinese rely on crude imports from this region. But while that is an absolute necessity for the Chinese and they cannot see the Strait of Hormuz blocked for too long, uh, they have a bigger issue. The bigger issue is China's growth has stalled. It's not double digits anymore. They're barely able to make 4 or 5%. This is not me saying it. This is the Chinese themselves admitting. And so they need to be able to have investments. They cannot afford trade restrictions. They're an exporting power. They need, they can't have restrictions on transfer of technology. This is something they have to work out with the Americans. So I think that is their more important conversation. But in the meantime, they're also seeing that their ally Pakistan all of a sudden is now playing a bigger role with the Americans on Iran, in where they have interest as well. So, and I have to assume that the Pakistanis keep their Chinese allies, you know, up to speed, if you will, as to what they're doing. But like any actor, you have to balance between the two sides. So not everything is necessarily shared with the other. You don't want to get caught in between this. Pakistan does not want to get caught in between this US-China thing. And so I think this came out of left field for the Chinese, this whole effort that Pakistan is going to be mediating. And so they wanted to know what's going on. Hence the reports about President Zardari going and meeting with the Chinese ambassador. And then there was, the reported trip by Deputy Prime Minister, Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar to Beijing. Uh, I think they wanted to know what was going on so that, and it's only natural. I mean, because they have to have a conversation with Trump, in a few weeks. So they need to be in the loop. And plus, they have interests on Iran as well. So I think that this is an example of how this relationship works. It's very unique, globally speaking, where you have a small, emerging middle power. I wouldn't even call it a middle power, Pakistan. And it has this relationship with China and the United States that it needs to manage. And I think it's done a pretty good job. And it's not just, in the current moment. We need to recall that the US and China had a détente because Pakistan facilitated the Nixon administration's efforts to reach out to Mao and at the time the founder of the People's Republic of China. And it's no secret that that Henry Kissinger flew to Beijing through Pakistan, and there are all sorts of stories around that. But my point is, this is a very unique relationship that I think has been managed by both powers themselves and by Pakistan as well. So, what are these regions? The names, this taxonomy, this nomenclature: Middle East, South Asia, South Caucasus, Central Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, et cetera, et cetera. They are 19th century constructs by the British Empire. And become internationalized, they've been accepted, cartographers have, generations of cartographers have done their work based on this. This has become the accepted norm. But this is only so old. I mean, it doesn't go back beyond that. I think the reality has moved on. And I think this is why the United States and this administration in particular should be given credit for recognizing that The world has changed. Those firewalled realities don't exist anymore. I'll give you a clear example. The fall of the Soviet Union led to the emergence of sovereign states. Let's just look at the South Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. They were part of, they were behind the Iron Curtain throughout the Cold War, from the end of World War II all the way to 1991. And even after 1991, until fairly recently, I would say as recent as the Ukraine war, they were part of the Russian sphere of influence. But Russia has weakened. Soviet Union is long gone, and these regions are geographically, linked to with the Middle East. Uh, all two countries, the two countries, Armenia and Azerbaijan, they have borders with Iran. Okay, so I think what's happening is that these classifications are becoming meaningless. There's more human connectivity, trans-regional connectivity. And I mean, just take, for example, why is Pakistan a country that has been classified in South Asia? Okay. Yes, the World Bank has now shifted Pakistan to the Middle East in its sort of organizing principle, according to that. And there are others, but Pakistan is in South Asia. But what is it doing in the Middle East? Because Pakistan has always been, the reality is Pakistan has always been part of the Middle East, as much as it is a part of South Asia. Likewise, why are the Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, why are they getting involved in the Board of Peace for Gaza? Because those boundaries, that is their shortest route to the high seas through Iran. So the Kazakhs and the Uzbeks and the rest of the Central Asian countries are looking at this as saying, we need a good outcome from this war in terms of an understanding between the United States and Iran that opens up Iran to investments. And so we can access the ocean. Because if you look at them, a country like Uzbekistan, we forget, and this is not noticed by many people, is double landlocked. Okay. It has no access. And to the north is Russia, to the east is China. And then you have this sort of Caspian Sea. And in order to get to the other side, you have to go through the South Caucasus, which is still trying to reach a final peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And then you get to Turkey and then to the Mediterranean Sea. But if Iran opens up, and this is the same argument, that was being made, that if Afghanistan stabilizes, then that's a pathway through Afghanistan, through Pakistan to the Indian Ocean. But you can still do it through Iran. I mean, both are potential opportunities. Obviously, Iran has more potential now given the war, and Afghanistan is on a slow burn given the way the Taliban regime is behaving and that reality. But this is what I mean by these regions becoming meaningless. And this is a project that we're working on at the Middle East Policy Council that I've become a part of. We're doing something called, we don't have a good name for it just yet, but it's a Greater Middle East, West Asia, Broader Eurasia project, where we're looking at what used to be the Middle East in the context of its broader strategic environment, looking at the bodies of water, the Mediterranean, the Red Sea. Look, sub-Saharan Africa you can't talk about the Middle East without talking about Ethiopia, and then go even further inland into the continent. Likewise, you can't say, oh, I'll stop at the border with Iran and Pakistan, and that's the Middle East for me. No, those days are long gone. And so we're trying to come up with a new way of looking at it. And that's what I meant by when I wrote in my article.